There's a word that helped justify a Holocaust. The same word, spoken a few thousand years earlier, meant something closer to honorable or noble. Nothing about skin color, nothing about blood, nothing about conquest. Somewhere between its birth on the Eurasian steppe and its adoption by the Nazi Party in the 20th century, that word got hijacked, twisted, and turned into one of the most dangerous ideas in modern history. The word is Aryan, and almost everything most people think they know about it is wrong. Strip away 2 centuries of politics and propaganda, and what's left underneath is a genuinely remarkable story. Not about a master race, but about a small, resourceful society of Bronze Age herders and metalworkers who, faced with a brutal and unforgiving landscape, reinvented warfare, transportation, and possibly the fate of 2 future civilizations. Roughly 4,000 years ago, on the harsh grassland border between modern Russia and Kazakhstan, just east of the Ural Mountains, a culture emerged that archaeologists today call Sintashta. These people built the first spoked wheels ever fitted to a war chariot. Every domesticated horse alive on Earth today can trace its lineage back to herds raised in the world they belonged to. Who were they? And how did people living in one of the least forgiving environments on the planet end up building something that would eventually reshape the ancient world? To answer that, we first need to deal with the word itself, because before we can talk about who the Aryans actually were, we have to talk about who they were falsely turned into. Here's what most people don't realize. In the ancient world, Aryan was never a bloodline or a skin tone. In Sanskrit and in Old Iranian, the word Arya, or Arya in its Avestan form, simply meant noble, civilized, or honorable. It was a title you earned through conduct, not something you inherited through ancestry. Anyone who lived by the values of a civilized society, who walked what the old texts called the path of truth and light, could be called Arya. The Persian Emperor Darius the Great proudly used the word to describe himself and his lineage in his own royal inscriptions. The very name of modern Iran descends from Aryanam, the land of the Aryans. In ancient Zoroastrian religious thought, an Arya was someone who followed the righteous path. Across the Indian subcontinent, Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain traditions all used the same word the same way, to describe a person of noble character and refined culture, never a race. So how did a word about virtue turn into one of history's ugliest weapons? The transformation started, oddly enough, with a genuine linguistic discovery. In 1786, a British judge and linguist named William Jones stood before the Asiatic Society in Calcutta and laid out an observation that would change the study of language forever. He'd noticed that Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin shared grammatical structures and vocabulary far too similar to be coincidence. He proposed that all 3 languages, along with several others, must have descended from a single, much older common ancestor. Today, we call that hypothetical ancestor Proto-Indo-European, and Jones's instinct turned out to be correct. It was one of the great breakthroughs of comparative linguistics. But 19th century Europe took that discovery and ran with it in a direction Jones never intended. French aristocrat Arthur de Gobineau, and later the British-born writer Houston Stewart Chamberlain, seized on the idea of a shared Aryan linguistic ancestor and twisted it into something else entirely. A claim that the people who spoke these original languages must have been a superior, fair-skinned race, destined to rule over supposedly lesser peoples. Gobineau published his theories in the 1850s. Chamberlain, writing decades later from Germany, took it even further, and his work went on to directly influence Adolf Hitler and the ideology of the Nazi Party. A word that once meant someone of good character became the intellectual scaffolding for the Holocaust. Meanwhile, a separate but related myth was taking shape in a different part of the world. The German-born scholar Max Müller, while translating the Rigveda, one of the oldest religious texts on Earth, floated an idea that came to be known as the Aryan invasion theory. According to Müller's narrative, a lighter-skinned Aryan people had swept down from the north sometime in antiquity, conquered the dark-skinned natives of the Indian subcontinent, enslaved them, and effectively founded Indian civilization on the ashes of the people they'd subjugated. Miller himself doesn't seem to have intended this as a racial argument, but British colonial administrators loved it, because it handed them a ready-made justification for their own rule. If ancient Aryans had once civilized India by conquest, then the British Empire was simply repeating history, bringing civilization to India all over again. By the mid-20th century, British archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler was digging through the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro, one of the great cities of the Indus Valley Civilization, and he claimed to have found the smoking gun, scattered human skeletons in the city's upper layers, which he presented as victims of a massacre carried out by invading Aryan warriors. There was just one problem: it wasn't true. In 1964, American archaeologist George Dales published a paper with a title that says it all: The Mythical Massacre at Mohenjo-Daro, systematically dismantling Wheeler's claim. The skeletons Wheeler pointed to came from different occupation layers spanning what could be centuries, not a single violent event. There were no mass graves, no burned buildings, no weapons of war, none of the physical signatures you'd expect from a genocidal invasion. Decades of further excavation and, more recently, ancient DNA analysis have only confirmed Dales's conclusion. There was no invasion and there was no massacre. So what actually happened to the Indus Valley Civilization? The real story starts far earlier and is frankly more impressive than any invasion myth. As early as 7000 BCE, farming communities like Mehrgarh in what's now Balochistan in Pakistan were already domesticating crops and animals along the edge of the Indus Plains. Over the following millennia, that early agricultural foundation grew into something extraordinary. By around 2600 BCE, cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa had become some of the most sophisticated urban centers on the planet, complete with covered drainage systems running beneath the streets, multi-story brick buildings, and architectural techniques for passive air cooling that wouldn't be matched anywhere else in the world for a very long time. This wasn't a civilization waiting to be conquered. It was one of the most advanced societies of the Bronze Age. What actually brought it down was climate, not conquest. Between roughly 1900 and 1500 BCE, the region entered a prolonged, punishing drought. Rainfall dropped, rivers that had sustained the cities for centuries began drying up, and at almost exactly the same time, political instability in trading partners like Mesopotamia and Egypt disrupted the long-distance trade networks the Indus cities depended on. Faced with collapsing water supplies and a collapsing economy, the population did the only sensible thing: they left. Not in a single dramatic exodus, but gradually, over generations, drifting south and east toward land that could still support them. It was a slow, quiet migration, not a sword through the heart of a civilization. And here's where the story gets genuinely interesting. Because at almost exactly the same time the Indus cities were emptying out, something very different was unfolding thousands of miles to the north, on the open grasslands beyond the Caspian and Aral seas. Sometime in the early 3rd millennium BCE, in the Dnieper River Valley, a fusion of European farming communities and steppe herding groups gave rise to what archaeologists call the corded ware culture, named somewhat unglamorously for the cord-like patterns pressed into their pottery. One branch of these people pushed steadily eastward into dense forests of pine, oak, and birch, evolving into what's now known as the Fatianovo culture. Pushing further still, toward the western foothills of the Ural Mountains, another group discovered copper and established some of the region's first genuinely permanent settlements. Archaeologists call this the Balanovo culture. A separate offshoot of this same broad population settled the transitional zone between forest and open steppe south of the Urals. These were the Abashevo people, and unlike their more settled cousins, they lived as mobile pastoralists, following herds of cattle, sheep, and horses across the grassland. setting up camp, moving on, setting up camp again. They weren't primitive by any means. They mined copper from the Ural foothills and forged it into axes, knives, and spearheads. But their lifestyle depended entirely on the freedom to keep moving, and that freedom was about to be taken away from them by the weather. Between roughly 2500 and 2000 BCE, the climate across the Eurasian steppe took a sharp turn for the worse, colder and far drier than before. For a population that survived by chasing fresh grass and open water across a vast open landscape, this was close to catastrophic. Grazing land shrank, water sources dried up, and cattle herds, the entire foundation of their economy, began dying in large numbers. The old nomadic rhythm simply stopped working. Survival now meant finding a reliable permanent water source and staying there, whatever the cost to their freedom of movement. They found what they needed in the wetlands along the upper Tobol and Ural rivers, marshy, reed-choked basins that, even through the harshest winters, still held enough water and vegetation to keep a herd alive. But there wasn't much of this land to go around, and as the climate kept squeezing the available grazing ground tighter and tighter, every group on the steppe converged on the same handful of survivable places. What had once been the occasional dispute over stolen cattle escalated into something far more brutal: organized, large-scale warfare over the last remaining resources capable of sustaining life. We don't have to guess how brutal it got. Near a site called Pepkino, in the forest steppe of the Middle Volga region, archaeologists uncovered a mass grave dated to somewhere around 2100 to 1950 BCE. Roughly 28 young men buried together, many of them showing clear evidence of decapitation and devastating wounds from bronze battle axes. This wasn't the aftermath of a raid gone wrong. The scale and nature of the injuries point to something closer to a full-scale battle, one clash in what was almost certainly a much longer and much wider conflict playing out across the region as competing groups fought for the last livable ground on a rapidly shrinking steppe. It was out of this exact pressure cooker, climate collapse, resource scarcity, and unrelenting warfare that a new culture was born. The portion of the Abashevo world that had settled east of the Urals began reshaping everything about how they lived: their pottery, their settlement patterns, their entire social structure. Historians and archaeologists now call this transformed society the Sintashta culture, and what they built next had never been seen anywhere on the Eurasian steppe before. They stopped being wanderers and became builders. Faced with constant threat, they began constructing massive, permanent fortified towns, something their ancestors, at most, had only ever attempted as temporary, thrown-together defenses. Archaeologists have identified more than 20 of these fortified settlements so far, scattered across the southern Trans-Ural region. Some were laid out as near-perfect circles, others rectangular, others shaped irregularly to fit the terrain. But every single one of them was engineered around one overriding priority: making sure nothing and no one could get inside without a fight. The site that gave the entire culture its name, Sintashta itself, on the banks of the river of the same name in what's now Chelyabinsk Oblast in Russia, was laid out as a tightly organized circular town roughly 140 meters across. Around its perimeter ran a thick wall of timber and packed earth, punctuated by wooden gate towers tall enough for a lookout to spot trouble from a long way off. And just outside that wall, they dug something their ancestors never had: a deep, V-shaped defensive ditch, engineered specifically to stop an enemy from ever reaching the base of the wall in the first place. Nearby settlements like Archaim and Kameny Ambar followed the same basic blueprint, each one a fortress built with real engineering intent, not improvisation. Walk through the gate of one of these towns, though, and you'd realize almost immediately that you weren't looking at an ordinary village. Inside the walls of a typical Sintashta settlement sat somewhere between 50 and 60 houses, tightly and deliberately arranged. And when archaeologists excavated them, they found something startling. Nearly every single house showed clear physical evidence of metalworking. Furnaces, slag, casting molds, the works. This wasn't just a fortified town. It was, functionally, a fortified industrial complex, a walled metallurgical production center, unlike anything the steppe had ever produced before. Raw copper, hauled in from mines in the Ural foothills, was smelted down inside these household furnaces and reforged into weapons and tools. The Sintashta people held on to some of their ancestors' traditions. Polished stone maces, for instance, carried over almost unchanged from their corded ware roots, but they pushed hard into new territory too, casting bronze daggers, bronze axes, and arrows tipped with flint or bone. They understood something their ancestors hadn't fully grasped. In a world this violent, walls alone weren't enough. You needed military superiority to actually survive. Interestingly, when they chose where to build these fortresses, they didn't pick the most defensible high ground available. Most Sintashta settlements sit on the first terrace above a river overlooking the floodplain below, a position that offered decent visibility but wasn't nearly as naturally defensible as a hilltop would have been. That wasn't an oversight. It reflected their actual priorities. Their whole economy, their whole survival, still rested on those cattle herds, and the herds depended on the wetlands below. Protecting the marsh mattered just as much as protecting the people living behind the wall. All of this, the concentration of copper, bronze, livestock, and skilled labor inside a handful of fortified towns, gave rise to something the steppe hadn't really had before either: a warrior elite. These were commanders who controlled enormous herds of horses, cattle, and sheep, oversaw stockpiles of bronze, and had skilled horse trainers, carpenters, and metalworkers working under them. Their social status was enormous, and nowhere is that clearer than in how they were buried. When one of these elite warriors died, the funeral wasn't a quiet affair. It was a massive, deliberately staged public event. Just outside the settlement walls, in full view of the town, their people raised enormous earthen burial mounds, or kurgans, some of them an astonishing 85 meters across and over 4 meters tall. What archaeologists found inside these mounds tells you exactly what this society valued. It generally wasn't piles of gold or silver jewelry. Buried alongside the dead were bronze axes, daggers, socketed bronze spearheads, polished stone maces, and, most remarkably, entire horses and chariots. Some graves contained as many as 8 sacrificed horses laid to rest with a single warrior, along with the remains of large-scale ritual feasts. They clearly believed that in whatever world came next, a warrior would still need his weapons, his chariot, and his horses to keep fighting. And that chariot, more than anything else they built, is the single invention that made the Sintashta name echo through the following 2,000 years of military history. Wheeled vehicles already existed before Sintashta came along, but their wheels were solid discs of wood, heavy, slow, and really only practical for hauling cargo. What the carpenters of Sintashta figured out was deceptively simple. Cut the solid wooden disc down to a rim connected by thin wooden spokes. The result was a wheel that was dramatically lighter while staying every bit as strong and mounted underneath a light wooden frame. That innovation produced the fastest, most lethal military vehicle the Bronze Age had ever seen. A fast chariot needs a fast horse to pull it, and this is where the story connects to something genuinely global. In 2021, a team of over 150 researchers led by geneticist Ludovic Orlando published an enormous ancient DNA study in the journal Nature, analyzing more than 270 horse genomes recovered from archaeological sites across Eurasia. What they found solved a mystery that had puzzled scientists for decades. Virtually every domestic horse alive on the planet today, from Arabian racehorses to plow horses to the horse in your neighbor's backyard, descends from a single population that emerged in the western steppe, centered on the lower Volga and Don River basins, not far to the west of the Sintashta world. And crucially, that new breed of horse exploded outward across Eurasia at almost exactly the same moment, roughly 2200 to 2000 BCE, spreading hand in hand with the equestrian technology the Sintashta culture had pioneered, chariots included, and rapidly replacing nearly every older horse lineage it encountered along the way. In other words, the era that gave the world the spoked wheel is the very same era that gave the world the horse we still ride today. On the battlefield, these chariots were devastating. Each one typically carried two warriors, one who handled the reins and controlled the horses with real precision, and a second who stood braced on the platform and hurled heavy flint-tipped javelins at the enemy. It's worth asking why they didn't simply fight on horseback instead. And the answer comes down to equipment that didn't exist yet. The wooden riding saddle was still roughly 1,000 years away from being invented, and stirrups even further out than that. Try to picture riding bareback at speed while attempting to throw a heavy spear with any accuracy, and you'll understand the problem immediately. It's nearly impossible to stay balanced and strike a target at the same time. A chariot solved that problem completely, giving a warrior a stable, moving platform from which he could throw with real force and real accuracy, something no lone horseman of that era could reliably manage. This new way of fighting reshaped the entire society around it. What used to be small-scale cattle raids between neighboring tribes escalated into sustained, large-scale campaigns for territory and resources. A force combining chariot warriors with infantry became something no rival group on the steppe could easily stand against. And their ambitions weren't purely military either. Riding for weeks or even months at a stretch, Sintashta traders pushed deep into unfamiliar territory, exchanging metal, weapons, and other valuable goods with distant societies and building long-range trade connections that hadn't existed before. For all that power, though, the Sintashta culture as a distinct, identifiable society only lasted around 300 to 400 years. That's a surprisingly short run for something this influential. But it wasn't a collapse. It was closer to the opposite. Their population kept growing, their herds kept expanding, their bronze industry kept scaling up, and eventually the small wetlands that had sustained them simply couldn't support the sheer size of what they'd become. At the same time, the climate was easing back towards something milder, and now they had fast horses and light chariots, mobility they had never possessed before. Staying locked inside one fortified valley no longer made sense when the whole steppe was suddenly within reach. So they spread out, mainly east and southeast, into a vastly larger cultural zone that archaeologists now call the Andronovo Horizon, stretching all the way from the Ural Mountains out to the Altai and Tian Shan ranges in Central Asia. Wherever they went, they carried Sintashta's inheritance with them: the chariot, the bronze smelting furnace, distinctive weapon styles, family burial kurgans, and, most consequentially of all, their language. Early Indo-Iranian, spoken in those fortified river towns, was about to become the ancestor of languages spoken by well over 1 billion people today. Sometime between roughly 1800 and 1600 BCE, this expanding population split along two major paths. One branch turned toward the Iranian plateau, eventually giving rise to the old Iranian languages and laying cultural groundwork that would, centuries later, underpin the Persian Empire, the great Persian kings, Darius among them, who proudly called themselves Aryan, weren't reaching for an empty title. Their roots traced directly back to this same steppe population. The other branch crossed the Hindu Kush mountains and entered the Indian subcontinent, the Indo-Aryans, whose arrival triggered a deep and lasting cultural blending with the people already living there, not a conquest. The clearest evidence of that migration and fusion survives in the Rigveda, one of the oldest religious texts on Earth. Its earliest layers, particularly what scholars label Books 2 through 7, describe a society that lines up strikingly with what archaeologists have dug out of the ground at Sintashta. reverent praise for fast, spoke-wheeled chariots, celebrated stories of chariot warfare, horses treated as nearly sacred, bronze weaponry, and elaborate funeral rites held in honor of fallen warriors. Even specific ritual details, the imagery surrounding the war god Indra's chariot, the ceremonial drinking of the sacred soma, echo burial customs excavated from kurgans on the Ural steppe, 4,000 years and thousands of miles removed from where the Rigveda was eventually composed. And the influence didn't stop at India's or Iran's borders. Chariot warfare spread with remarkable speed through the ancient world, reaching the Shang dynasty in China and the armies of the Egyptian pharaohs, permanently rewriting the tactics of ancient warfare across multiple continents. The horses they painstakingly bred are, quite literally, still with us. Every racehorse thundering down a track today, every workhorse pulling a plow, carries a direct genetic line back to that world. So here's where all of this actually lands. The real Aryans were never a master race. They weren't white supremacists. They weren't a horde of invaders who rode in and burned civilizations to the ground. And they certainly never asked to be turned into the justification for a genocide that happened 3,500 years after they were gone. They were something much smaller and, honestly, much more remarkable than that. A resourceful, adaptive society that faced down one of the harshest environments on Earth and came out the other side having permanently changed how humans fight, how humans travel, and how humans speak. The word they used for themselves, Arya, never meant bloodline. It meant someone trying to live rightly, someone walking, as the old texts put it, toward the light instead of away from it. It took people living continents away, centuries later, to take a word about decency and twist it into something monstrous. Their fortress walls are buried under grass and soil now, quiet and mostly forgotten. But their inheritance never actually went anywhere. It's sitting in the words we still speak, in the horses still racing across finish lines around the world, and in a story that took 4,000 years, several empires and one genuinely evil ideology to fully untangle. If deep dives like this, the kind that actually chase a story back to where it started instead of settling for the easy version, are your thing, stick around. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one, and if there's a moment in this story that caught you off guard, drop it in the comments. I'd genuinely like to know. See you in the next one.